Chapter 31, Part 1 of The Italian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 31, Part 1. O holy nun, why bend the mournful head? Why fall those tears from lids uplift in prayer? Why o'er thy pale cheek steals the feeble blush, then fades and leaves it wan as the lily on which a moonbeam falls? While these events were passing in the prisons of the Inquisition at Rome, Elena, in the sanctuary of Our Lady of Pity, remained ignorant of Schedoni's arrest and of Vivaldi's situation. She understood that the confessor was preparing to acknowledge her for his daughter, and believed that she comprehended also the motive for his absence. But though he had forbidden her to expect a visit from him till his arrangement should be completed, he had promised to write in the meantime, and inform her of all the present circumstances of Vivaldi. His unexpected silence had excited, therefore, apprehensions as various, though not so terrible, as those which Vivaldi had suffered for her; nor did the silence of Vivaldi himself appear less extraordinary. "His confinement must be severe indeed," said the afflicted Elena, "since he cannot relieve my anxiety by a single line of intelligence. Or perhaps, harassed by unceasing opposition, he has submitted to the command of his family, and has consented to forget me. Ah, why did I leave the opportunity for that command to his family? Why did I not enforce it myself?" Yet, while she uttered this self-reproach, the tears she shed contradicted the pride which had suggested it, and a conviction lurking in her heart that Vivaldi could not so resign her soon dissipated those tears. But other conjectures recalled them. It was possible that he was ill, that he was dead. In such vague and gloomy surmise her days passed away. Employment could no longer withdraw her from herself, nor music, even for a moment, charm away the sense of sorrow. Yet she regularly partook of the various occupations of the nuns, and was so far from permitting herself to indulge in any useless expression of anxiety, that she had never once disclosed the sacred subject of it; so that, though she could not assume an air of cheerfulness, she never appeared otherwise than tranquil. Her most soothing, yet perhaps most melancholy hour, was when about sunset she could withdraw unnoticed to the terrace among the rocks that overlooked the convent and formed a part of its domain. There, alone and relieved from all the ceremonial restraints of the society, her very thoughts seemed more at liberty. As from behind the light foliage of the acacias, or the more majestic shade of the plane trees that waved their branches over the many-coloured cliffs of this terrace, Elena looked down upon the magnificent scenery of the bay. It brought back to memory, in sad yet pleasing detail, the many happy days she had passed on those blue waters, or on the shores, in the society of Vivaldi and her departed relative Bianchi; and every point of the prospect, marked by such remembrance, which the veiling distance stole, was rescued by imagination, and pictured by affection in tints more animated than those in brightest nature. One evening Elena had lingered on the terrace later than usual. She had watched the rays retiring from the highest points of the horizon, and the fading imagery of the lower scene, till, the sun having sunk into the waves, all colouring was withdrawn, except an empurpling and reposing hue, which overspread the waters and the heavens, and blended in soft confusion every feature of the landscape. The roofs and slender spires of the Santa della Pieta, with a single tower of the church rising loftily over every other part of the buildings that composed the convent, were fading fast from the eye; but the solemn tint that invested them accorded so well with their style, that Elena was unwilling to relinquish this interesting object. Suddenly she perceived through the dubious light an unusual number of moving figures in the court of the great cloister, and, listening, she fancied she could distinguish the murmuring of many voices. The white drapery of the nuns rendered them conspicuous as they moved, but it was impossible to ascertain who were the individuals engaged in this bustle. Presently the assemblage dispersed, and Elena, curious to understand the occasion of what she had observed, prepared to descend to the convent. She had left the terrace, and was about to enter a long avenue of chestnuts that extended to a part of the convent communicating immediately with the great court, when she heard approaching steps, and, on turning into the walk, perceived several persons advancing in the shady distance. Among the voices, as they drew nearer, she distinguished one whose interesting tone engaged all her attention, and began also to awaken memory. She listened, wondered, doubted, hoped, and feared. It spoke again. Elena thought she could not be deceived in those tender accents, so full of intelligence, so expressive of sensibility and refinement. She proceeded with quicker steps, yet faltered as she drew near the group, and paused to discern whether among them was any figure that might accord with the voice and justify her hopes. The voice spoke again. It pronounced her name, pronounced it with the tremblings of tenderness and impatience, and Elena scarcely dared to trust her senses when she beheld Olivia, the nun of San Stefano, in the cloisters of the Della Pieta. Elena could find no words to express her joy and surprise on beholding her preserver in safety, and in those quiet groves. But Olivia repaid all the affectionate caresses of her young friend, and while she promised to explain the circumstance that had led to her present appearance here, she, in turn, made numerous inquiries relative to Elena's adventures after she had quitted San Stefano. They were now, however, surrounded by too many auditors to allow of unreserved conversation. Elena, therefore, led the nun to her apartment, and Olivia then explained her reasons for having left the convent of San Stefano, which were indeed sufficient to justify, even with the most rigid devotee, her conduct as to the change. This unfortunate recluse, it appeared, persecuted by the suspicions of the abbess, who understood that she had assisted in the liberation of Elena, had petitioned the bishop of her diocese for leave to remove to the Santa della Pieta. The abbess had not proof to proceed formally against her as an accomplice in the escape of a novice, for though Geronimo could have supplied the requisite evidence, he was too deeply implicated in this adventure to do so without betraying his own conduct. From his having withheld such proof, it appears, however, that accident rather than design had occasioned his failure on the evening of Elena's departure from the monastery. But though the abbess had not testimony enough for legal punishment, she was acquainted with circumstances sufficient to justify suspicion, and had both the inclination and the power to render Olivia very miserable. In her choice of the Santa della Pieta, the nun was influenced by many considerations, some of which were the consequence of conversations she had held with Elena respecting the state of that society. Her design she had been unable to disclose to her friend, lest by a discovery of such correspondence the abbess of San Stefano should obtain grounds on which to proceed against her. Even in her appeal to the bishop, the utmost caution and secrecy had been necessary till the order for her removal, procured not without considerable delay and difficulty, arrived, and when it came, the jealous anger of the superior rendered an immediate departure necessary. Olivia, during many years, had been unhappy in her local circumstances, but it is probable she would have concluded her days within the walls of San Stefano, had not the aggravated oppression of the abbess aroused her courage and activity, and dissipated the despondency with which severe misfortune had obscured her views. Elena was particular in her inquiries whether any person of the monastery had suffered for the assistance they had given her, but learned that no one except Olivia had been suspected of befriending her, and then understood that the venerable friar who had dared to unfasten the gate which restored her with Vivaldi to liberty had not been involved by his kindness. "It is an embarrassing and rather an unusual circumstance," concluded Olivia, "to change one's convent; but you've perceived the strong reasons which determined me upon a removal. I was, however, perhaps, the more impatient of severe treatment, since you, my sister, had described to me the society of Our Lady of Pity, and since I believed it possible that you might form a part of it. When, on my arrival here, I learned that my wishes had not deceived me on this point, I was impatient to see you once more, and as soon as the ceremonies attending an introduction to the superior were over, I requested to be conducted to you, and was in search of you when we met in the avenue. It is unnecessary for me to insist upon the satisfaction which this meeting gives me, but you may not, perhaps, understand how much the manners of Our Lady Abbess, and of the sisterhood in general, as far as a first interview will allow me to judge of them, have reanimated me. The gloom which has long hung over my prospects seems now to open, and a distant gleam promises to light up the evening of my stormy day." Olivia paused, and appeared to recollect herself. This was the first time she had made so direct a reference to her own misfortunes; and while Elena silently remarked it, and observed the dejection which was already stealing upon the expressive countenance of the nun, she wished, yet feared to lead her back towards the subject of them. Endeavouring to dismiss some painful remembrance, and assuming a smile of languid gaiety, Olivia said, "Now that I have related the history of my removal, and sufficiently indulged my egotism, will you let me hear what adventures have befallen you, my young friend, since the melancholy adieu you gave me in the gardens of San Stefano?" This was a task to which Elena's spirits, though revived by the presence of Olivia, were still unequal. Over the scenes of her past distress time had not yet drawn his shadowing veil. The colours were all too fresh and garish for the meek dejection of her eye, and the subject was too intimately connected with that of her present anxiety to be reviewed without very painful feelings. She therefore requested Olivia to spare her from a detail of particulars, which she could not recollect but with extreme reluctance; and scrupulously observing the injunction of Schedoni, she merely mentioned her separation from Vivaldi upon the banks of the Celano, and that a variety of distressing circumstances had intervened before she could regain the sanctuary of the Della Pieta. Olivia understood too well the kind of feelings from which Elena was desirous of escaping, willingly to subject her to a renewal of them, and felt too much generous compassion for her sufferings not to endeavour to soothe the sense of them by an exertion of those delicate and nameless arts which, while they mock detection, fascinate the weary spirit as by a charm of magic. The friends continued in conversation till a chime from a chapel of the convent summoned them to the last vespers; and when the service had concluded, they separated for the night. With the society of the Santa della Pieta, Olivia had thus found an asylum such as till lately she had never dared to hope for; but though she frequently expressed her sense of this blessing, it was seldom without tears, and Elena observed with some surprise and more disappointment, within a very few days after her arrival, a cloud of melancholy spreading again over her mind. But a nearer interest soon withdrew Elena's attention from Olivia to fix it upon Vivaldi; and when she saw her infirm old servant, Beatrice, enter a chamber of the convent, she anticipated that the knowledge of some extraordinary and probably unhappy event had brought her. She knew too well the circumspection of Schedoni to believe that Beatrice came commissioned from him; and as the uncertain situation of Vivaldi was so constantly the subject of her anxiety, she immediately concluded that her servant came to announce some evil relative to him. His indisposition, perhaps his actual confinement in the Inquisition, which lately she had sometimes been inclined to think might not have been a mere menace to Vivaldi, though it had proved to be no more to herself; or possibly she came to tell of his death in those prisons. This last was a possibility that almost incapacitated her for inquiring what was the errand of Beatrice. The old servant, trembling and wan, either from the fatigue of her walk or from a consciousness of disastrous intelligence, seated herself without speaking, and some moments elapsed before she could be prevailed with to answer the repeated inquiries of Elena. "Oh, Signora," she said at length, "you do not know what it is to walk uphill such a long way at my age. Well, Heaven protect you, I hope you never will." "I perceive you bring ill news," said Elena. "I am prepared for it, and you need not fear to tell me all you know." "Holy San Marco!" exclaimed Beatrice, "if death be ill news, you have guessed right, Signora, for I do bring news of that, it is certain. How came you, lady, to know my errand? They have been beforehand with me, I see, though I have not walked so fast uphill this many a day as I have now, to tell you what has happened." She stopped on observing the changing countenance of Elena, who tremulously called upon her to explain what had happened, who was dead, and entreated her to relate the particulars as speedily as possible. "You said you was prepared, Signora," said Beatrice, "but your look tells another tale." "What is the event you would disclose?" said Elena, almost breathless. "When did it happen? Be brief." "I cannot tell exactly when it happened, Signora, but it was an own servant of the Marchese's that I had it from." "The Marchese's?" interrupted Elena, in a faltering voice. "Ay, lady, you will say that is pretty good authority." "Death! and in the Marchese's family!" exclaimed Elena. "Yes, Signora, I had it from his own servant. He was passing by the garden gate just as I happened to be speaking to the macaroni man." "But you are ill, lady." "I am very well, if you will but proceed," replied Elena, faintly, while her eyes were fixed upon Beatrice, as if they only had power to enforce her meaning. "Well, dame," he says to me, "I have not seen you of a long time. No," says I, "that is a great grievance, truly, for old women nowadays are not much thought of; out of sight, out of mind with them nowadays." "I beseech you to the purpose," interrupted Elena. "Whose death did he announce?" She had not courage to pronounce Vivaldi's name. "You shall hear, Signora. I saw he looked in a sort of a bustle, so I asked him how all did at the palazzo. So he answers, 'Bad enough, Signora Beatrice. Have not you heard?' 'Heard?' says I. 'What should I have heard?' 'Why,' says he, 'of what has just happened in our family.'" "Oh, heavens!" exclaimed Elena, "he is dead! Vivaldi is dead!" "You shall hear, Signora." continued Beatrice. "Be brief," said Elena. "Answer me simply, yes or no." "I cannot, till I come to the right place, Signora. If you will but have a little patience, you shall hear all. But if you fluster me so, you will put me quite out." "Grant me patience," said Elena, endeavouring to calm her spirits. "With that, Signora, I asked him to walk in and rest himself, and tell me all about it. He answered, he was in a great hurry, and could not stay a moment, and a great deal of that sort. But I, knowing that whatever happened in that family, Signora, was something to you, would not let him go off so easily. And so, when I asked him to refresh himself with a glass of lemon ice, he forgot all his business in a minute, and we had a long chat." And Beatrice might now have continued her circumlocution perhaps as long as she had pleased, for Elena had lost all power to urge inquiry, and was scarcely sensible of what was said. She neither spoke nor shed a tear. The one image that possessed her fancy, the image of Vivaldi dead, seemed to hold all her faculties, as by a spell. "So when I asked him," added Beatrice, "again what had happened, he was ready enough to tell all about it. 'It is near a month ago,' said he, 'since she was first taken. The marchesa had been—'" "The marchesa!" repeated Elena, with whom that one word had dissolved the spell of terror. "The marchesa!" "Yes, Signora, to be sure. Who else did I say it was?" "Go on, Beatrice. The marchesa. What makes you look so glad all of a sudden, Signora? I thought just now you was very sorry about it." "What?" "I warned you was thinking about my young lord, Vivaldi." "Proceed," said Elena. "Well," added Beatrice, "it was about a month ago that the marchesa was first taken," continued the varlet. "She had seemed poorly a long time, but it was from a conversation at the Di Voglio palazzo that she came home so ill. It is supposed she had been long in a bad state of health, but nobody thought her so near her end till the doctors were called together, and then matters looked very bad indeed. They found out that she had been dying, or as good, for many years, though nobody else had suspected it, and the marchesa's own physician was blamed for not finding it out before. But he," added the rogue, "had a regard for my lady. He was very obstinate too, for he kept saying almost to the last there was no danger, when everybody else saw how it was going. The other doctors soon made their words good, and my lady died." "And her son," said Elena, "was he with the marchesa when she expired?" "What, Signor Vivaldi, lady? No, the Signora was not there." "That is very extraordinary," observed Elena, with emotion. "Did the servant mention him?" "Yes, Signora. He said what a sad thing it was, that he should be out of the way at that time, and nobody know where." "Are his family then ignorant where he is?" asked Elena, with increased emotion. "To be sure they are, lady, and have been for these many weeks. They have heard nothing at all of the Signor, or one Paolo Mendrico, his servant, though the marchesa's people have been riding post after them from one end of the kingdom to the other all the time." Shocked with the conviction of a circumstance which till lately she scarcely believed was possible, the imprisonment of Vivaldi in the Inquisition, Elena lost for a while all power of further inquiry; but Beatrice proceeded. "The lady marchesa seemed to lay something much to heart, as the man told me, and often inquired for Signor Vincentio." "The marchesa, you are sure, then, was ignorant where he was," said Elena, with now astonishment and perplexity as to the person who, after betraying him into the Inquisition, could yet have suffered her, though arrested at the same time, to escape. "Yes, Signora, for she wanted sadly to see him. And when she was dying, she sent for her confessor, one Father Scadoni, I think they call him, and—" "What of him?" said Elena incautiously. "Nothing, Signora, for he could not be found." "Not be found," repeated Elena. "No, Signora, not just then. He was confessor, I warrant, to other people beside the marchesa, and I dare say they had sins enough to confess, so he could not get away in a hurry." Elena recollected herself sufficiently to ask no further of Scadoni; and when she considered the probable cause of Vivaldi's arrest, she was again consoled by a belief that he had not fallen into the power of real officials, since the comrades of the men who had arrested him had proved themselves otherwise; and she thought it highly probable that, while undiscovered by his family, he had been, and was still, engaged in searching for the place of her confinement. "But I was saying," proceeded Beatrice, "what a bustle there was when my lady the marchesa was dying. As this Father Scadoni was not to be found, another confessor was sent for, and shut up with her for a long while indeed; and then my lord marchese was called in. and there seemed to be a deal going forward, for my lord was heard every now and then by the attendants in the antechamber talking loud, and sometimes my lady Marchesa's voice was heard too, though she was so ill. At last all was silent, and after some time my lord came out of the room, and he seemed very much flustered, they say, that is, very angry and yet very sorrowful. But the confessor remained with my lady for a long while after, and when he departed my lady appeared more unhappy than ever. She lived all that night and part of the next day, and something seemed to lie very heavy at her heart, for she sometimes wept, but oftener groaned, and would look so that it was piteous to see her. She frequently asked for the marchese, and when he came, the attendants were sent away, and they held long conferences by themselves. The confessor also was sent for again, just at the last, and they were all shut up together. After this, my lady appeared more easy in her mind, and not long after she died. Chapter 31. Chapter 31. Part 2 of the Italian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 31. Part 2. Elena, who had attended closely to this little narrative, was prevented, for the present, from asking the few questions which had suggested by the entrance of Olivia, who, on perceiving a stranger, was retiring, but Elena, not considering these inquiries as important, prevailed with the nun to take a chair at the embroidery frame she had lately quitted. After conversing for a few moments with Olivia, she returned to a consideration of her own interests. The absence of Schedoni still appeared to her as something more than accidental, and though she could not urge any inquiry with Beatrice concerning the monk of the Spirito Santo, she ventured to ask whether she had lately seen the stranger who had restored her to Altieri, for Beatrice knew him only in the character of Elena's deliverer. "No, signora," replied Beatrice rather sharply. "I have never seen his face since he attended you to the villa, though, for that matter, I did not see much of it there; and then how he contrived to let himself out of the house that night without my seeing him, I cannot divine, though I have thought of it often enough since. I am sure he need not to have been ashamed to have shown his face to me, for I should only have blessed him for bringing you safe home again." Elena was somewhat surprised to find that Beatrice had noticed a circumstance apparently so trivial, and replied that she had herself opened the door for her protector. While Beatrice spoke, Olivia, raising her eyes from the embroidery, had fixed them upon the old servant, who respectfully withdrew hers; but when the nun was again engaged on her work, she resumed her observation. Elena fancied she perceived something extraordinary in this mutual examination, although the curiosity of strangers towards each other might have accounted for it. Beatrice then received directions from Elena as to some drawings which she wished to have sent to the convent, and when the servant spoke in reply, Olivia again raised her eyes, and fixed them on her face with intense curiosity. "I certainly ought to know that voice," said the nun with great emotion, "though I dare not judge from your features. Can it be possible, is it Beatrice Olca to whom I speak? So many years have passed." Beatrice, with equal surprise, answered, "It is, signora, you are right in my name; but, lady, who are you that know me?" While she earnestly regarded Olivia, there was an expression of dismay in her look, which increased Elena's perplexity. The nun's complexion varied every instant, and her words failed when she attempted to speak. Beatrice meanwhile exclaimed, "My eyes deceive me, yet there is a strange likeness. Santa della Pieta, how it has fluttered me! My heart beats still. You are so like her, lady, yet you are very different too." Olivia, whose regards were now entirely fixed upon Elena, said in a voice that was scarcely articulate, while her whole frame seemed sinking beneath some irresistible feeling, "Tell me, Beatrice, I conjure you, quickly say, who is this?" She pointed to Elena, and the sentence died on her lips. Beatrice, wholly occupied by interests of her own, gave no reply, but exclaimed, "It is in truth the Lady Olivia! It is herself! In the name of all that is sacred, how came you here? Oh, how glad you must have been to find one another out!" She looked, still gasping with astonishment, at Olivia, while Elena, unheard, repeatedly inquired the meaning of her words, and in the next moment found herself pressed to the bosom of the nun, who seemed better to have understood them, and who, weeping, trembling, and almost fainting, held her there in silence. Elena, after some moments had thus passed, requested an explanation of what she witnessed, and Beatrice at the same time demanded the cause of all this emotion. "For can it be that you did not know one another?" she added. "What new discovery is this?" said Elena, fearfully, to the nun. "It is but lately that I have found my father. Oh, tell me by what tender name I am to call you." "Your father!" exclaimed Olivia. "Your father, lady," echoed Beatrice. Elena, betrayed by strong emotion into this premature mention of Schedoni, was embarrassed, and remained silent. "No, my child," said Olivia, softening from amazement into tones of ineffable sorrow, while she again pressed Elena to her heart. "No, thy father is in the grave." Elena no longer returned her caresses. Surprise and doubt suspended every tender emotion. She gazed upon Olivia with an intenseness that partook of wildness. At length she said slowly, "It is my mother, then, whom I see. When will these discoveries end?" "It is your mother," replied Olivia solemnly. "A mother's blessing rests with you." The nun endeavoured to soothe the agitated spirits of Elena, though she was herself nearly overwhelmed by the various and acute feelings this disclosure occasioned. For a considerable time they were unable to speak but in short sentences of affectionate exclamation, but joy was evidently a more predominant feeling with the parent than with the child. When, however, Elena could weep, she became more tranquil, and by degrees was sensible of a degree of happiness, such as she had perhaps never experienced. Meanwhile, Beatrice seemed lost in amazement mingled with fear. She expressed no pleasure, notwithstanding the joy she witnessed, but was uniformly grave and observant. Olivia, when she recovered some degree of composure, inquired for her sister Bianchi. The silence and sudden dejection of Elena indicated the truth. On this mention of her late mistress, Beatrice recovered the use of speech. "Alas, lady," said the old servant, "she is now where I believed you were, and I should as soon have expected to see my dear mistress here as yourself." Olivia, though affected by this intelligence, did not feel it with the acuteness she would have done probably at any other moment. After she had indulged her fears, she added that from the unusual silence of Bianchi she had suspected the truth, and particularly since not any answer had been returned to the letter she had sent to Altieri upon her arrival at the Santa della Pieta. "Alas," said Beatrice, "I wonder much my lady abbess failed to tell you the sad news, for she knew it too well. My dear mistress is buried in the church here. As for the letter, I have brought it with me for Signora Elena to open." "The lady abbess is not informed of our relationship," replied Olivia, "and I have particular reasons for wishing that at present she should remain ignorant of it. Even you, my Elena, must appear only as my friend, till some inquiries have been made which are essential to my peace." Olivia required an explanation of Elena's late extraordinary assertion respecting her father; but this was a request made with emotions very different from those which hope or joy inspire. Elena, believing that the same circumstances which had deceived herself during so many years as to his death had also misled Olivia, was not surprised at the incredulity her mother had shown, but she was considerably embarrassed how to answer her inquiries. It was now too late to observe the promise of secrecy extorted from her by Schedoni. The first moments of surprise had betrayed her. Yet, while she trembled further to transgress his injunction, she perceived that a full explanation was now unavoidable. And since Elena considered that, as Schedoni could not have foreseen her present peculiar situation, his command had no reference to her mother, her scruples on this head disappeared. When, therefore, Beatrice had withdrawn, Elena repeated her assertion that her father still lived, which, though it increased the amazement of Olivia, did not vanquish her incredulity. Olivia's tears flowed fast, while, in contradiction to this assurance, she mentioned the year in which the Count di Bruno died, with some circumstances relative to his death, which, however, as Elena understood that her mother had not witnessed it, she still believed had not happened. To confirm her late assertion, Elena then related a few particulars of her second interview with Schedoni, and, as some confirmation that he lived, offered to produce the portrait which he had claimed as his own. Olivia, in great agitation, requested to see the miniature, and Elena left the apartment in search of it. Every moment of her absence was to Olivia's expectation lengthened to an hour. She paced the room, listened for a footstep, endeavoured to tranquillize her spirits, and still Elena did not return. Some strange mystery seemed to lurk in the narrative she had just heard, which she wished, yet dreaded to develop; and when at length Elena appeared with the miniature, she took it in trembling eagerness, and having gazed upon it for an instant, her complexion faded, and she fainted. Elena had now no doubt respecting the truth of Schedoni's declaration, and blamed herself for not having more gradually prepared her mother for the knowledge of a circumstance which she believed had overwhelmed her with joy. The usual applications, however, soon restored Olivia, who, when she was again alone with her daughter, desired to behold once more the portrait. Elena, attributing the strong emotion with which she still regarded it to surprise and fear lest she was admitting a fallacious hope, endeavoured to comfort her by renewed assurances, that not only the Count di Bruno yet existed, but that he lived at this very time in Naples, and further that he would probably be in her presence within the hour. "When I quitted the room for the miniature," added Elena, "I dispatched a person with a note, requesting to see my father immediately, being impatient to realize the joy which such a meeting between my long-lost parents must occasion." In this instance, Elena had certainly suffered her generous sympathy to overcome her discretion; for though the contents of the note to Schedoni could not positively have betrayed him, had he even been in Naples at this time, her sending it to the Spirito Santo instead of the place which he had appointed for his letters might have led to a premature inquiry respecting herself. While Elena had acquainted Olivia that Schedoni would probably be with them soon, she watched eagerly for the joyful surprise she expected would appear on her countenance. How severe then was her disappointment when only terror and dismay were expressed there, and when in the next moment her mother uttered exclamations of distress, and even of despair. "If he sees me," said Olivia, "I am irrecoverably lost. Oh, unhappy Elena, your precipitancy has destroyed me. The original of this portrait is not the Count di Bruno, my dear lord, nor your parent, but his brother, the cruel husband." Olivia left the sentence unfinished, as if she was betraying more than was at present discreet; but Elena, whom astonishment had kept silent, now entreated that she would explain her words, and the cause of her distress. "I know not," said Olivia, "by what means that portrait has been conveyed to you, but it is the resemblance of the Count Ferrando di Bruno, the brother of my lord, and my second husband," she should have said, but her lips refused to honour him with the title. She paused and was much affected, but presently added, "I cannot at present explain the subject more fully, for it is to me a very distressing one. Let me rather consider the means of avoiding an interview with Di Bruno, and even of concealing, if possible, that I exist." Olivia was, however, soothed when she understood that Elena had not named her in the note, but had merely desired to see the confessor upon a very particular occasion. While they were consulting upon the excuse it would be necessary to form for this imprudent summons, the messenger returned with the note unopened, and with information that Father Schedoni was abroad on a pilgrimage, which was the explanation the brothers of the Spirito Santo chose to give of his absence, judging it prudent, for the honour of their convent, to conceal his real situation. Olivia, thus relieved from her fears, consented to explain some points of the subject so interesting to Elena; but it was not till several days after this discovery that she could sufficiently command her spirits to relate the whole of her narrative. The first part of it agreed perfectly with the account delivered in the confession to the penitentiary Ansaldo. That which follows was known only to herself, her sister Bianchi, a physician, and one faithful servant who had been considerately entrusted with the conduct of the plan. It may be recollected that Schedoni left his house immediately after the act, which was designed to be fatal to the countess his wife, and that she was carried senseless to her chamber. The wound, as appears, was not mortal; but the atrocity of the intent determined her to seize the opportunity thus offered by the absence of Schedoni, and her own peculiar circumstances, to release herself from his tyranny without having recourse to a court of justice, which would have covered with infamy the brother of her first husband. She withdrew, therefore, from his house forever, and, with the assistance of the 3 persons before mentioned, retired to a remote part of Italy, and sought refuge in the convent of San Stefano, while at home the report of her death was confirmed by a public funeral. Bianchi remained for some time after the departure of Olivia in her own residence near the Villa di Bruno, having taken under her immediate care the daughter of the countess and of the first Count di Bruno, as well as an infant daughter of the second. After some time had elapsed, Bianchi withdrew with her young charge, but not to the neighborhood of San Stefano. The indulgence of a mother's tenderness was denied to Olivia, for Bianchi could not reside near the convent without subjecting her to the hazard of a discovery, since Schedoni, though he now believed the report of her death, might be led to doubt it by the conduct of Bianchi, whose steps would probably be observed by him. She chose a residence, therefore, at a distance from Olivia, though not yet at Altieri. At this period Elena was not 2 years old, the daughter of Schedoni was scarcely as many months, and she died before the year concluded. It was this his child for whom the confessor, who had too well concealed himself to permit Bianchi to acquaint him with her death, had mistaken Elena, and to which mistake his own portrait, affirmed by Elena to be that of her father, had contributed. This miniature she had found in the cabinet of Bianchi after her aunt's decease, and, observing it inscribed with the title of Count di Bruno, she had worn it with a filial fondness ever since that period. Bianchi, when she had acquainted Elena with the secret of her birth, was withheld, both by prudence and humanity, from entrusting her with a knowledge that her mother lived; but this, no doubt, was the circumstance she appeared so anxious to disclose on her deathbed, when the suddenness of her disorder had deprived her of the power. The abruptness of that event had thus contributed to keep the mother and daughter unknown to each other, even when they afterwards accidentally met, to which concealment the name of Rosalba, given to Elena from her infancy by Bianchi, for the purpose of protecting her from the discovery by her uncle, had assisted. Beatrice, who was not the domestic entrusted with the escape of Olivia, had believed the report of her death; and thus, though she knew Elena to be the daughter of the Countess di Bruno, she could never have been a means of discovering them to each other, had it not happened that Olivia recognized this ancient servant of Bianchi when Elena was present. When Bianchi came to reside in the neighborhood of Naples, she was unsuspicious that Schedoni, who had never been heard of since the night of the assassination, inhabited there; and she so seldom left her house, that it is not surprising she should never happen to meet him, at least consciously; for her veil and the monk's cowl might easily have concealed them from each other if they had met. It appears to have been the intention of Bianchi to disclose to Vivaldi the family of Elena, before their nuptials were solemnized; since, on the evening of their last conversation, she had declared, when her spirits were exhausted by the exertion she had made, that much remained for her to say, which weakness obliged her to defer till another opportunity. Her unexpected death prevented any future meeting. That she had not sooner intended to make a communication, which might have removed in a considerable degree the objection of the Vivaldi to a connection with Elena, appears extraordinary, till other circumstances of her family than that of its nobility are considered. Her present indigence, and yet more, the guilt attached to an individual of the Di Bruno, it was reasonable to suppose would operate as a full antidote to the allurement of rank, however jealous of birth the Vivaldi had proved themselves. Fernando di Bruno had contrived, even in the short interval between the death of his brother and the supposed decease of his wife, again to embarrass his affairs, and soon after his flight, the income arising from what remained of his landed property had been seized upon by his creditors, whether lawfully or not. He was then in a situation which did not permit him to contest, and Elena was thus left wholly dependent upon her aunt. The small fortune of Bianchi had been diminished by the assistance she afforded Olivia, for whose admittance into the convent of San Stefano it had been necessary to advance a considerable sum; and her original income was afterwards reduced by the purchase of the Villa Altieri. This expenditure, however, was not an imprudent one, since she preferred the comforts and independence of a pleasant home, with industry, to the indulgence of an indolence which must have confined her to an inferior residence, and was acquainted with the means of making this industry profitable without being dishonorable. She excelled in many elegant and ingenious arts, and the productions of her pencil and needle were privately disposed of to the nuns of the Santa della Pieta. When Elena was of an age to assist her, she resigned much of the employment and the profit to her niece, whose genius having unfolded itself, the beauty of her designs and the elegance of her execution, both in drawings and embroidery, were so highly valued by the purchasers at the grate of the convent, that Bianchi committed to Elena altogether the exercise of her art. Olivia, meanwhile, had dedicated her life to devotion in the monastery of San Stefano, a choice which was willingly made, while her mind was yet softened by grief for the death of her first lord, and wearied by the cruelty she had afterwards experienced. The first years of her retirement were passed in tranquillity, except when the remembrance of her child, whom she did not dare to see at the convent, awakened a parental pang. With Bianchi she, however, corresponded as regularly as opportunity would allow, and had at least the consolation of knowing that the object most dear to her lived, till, within a short period of Elena's arrival at the very asylum chosen by her mother, her apprehensions were in some degree excited by the unusual silence of Bianchi. When Olivia had first seen Elena in the chapel of San Stefano, she was struck with a slight resemblance she bore to the late Count di Bruno, and had frequently afterwards examined her features with a most painful curiosity; but, circumstanced as she was, Olivia could not reasonably suspect the stranger to be her daughter. Once, however, a sense of this possibility so far overcame her judgment as to prompt an inquiry for the surname of Elena; but the mention of Rosalba had checked all further conjecture. What would the feelings of the nun, when she had been told, when her generous compassion was assisting a stranger to escape from oppression, that she was preserving her own child? It may be worthy of observation that the virtues of Olivia, exerted in a general cause, had thus led her unconsciously to the happiness of saving her daughter, while the vices of Schedoni had as unconsciously urged him to nearly destroy his niece, and had always been preventing, by the means they prompted him to employ, the success of his constant aim. Chapter 32. Chapter 32 of The Italian. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. The Italian, by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 32. Those hours which lately smiled, where are they now? Pallid to thought and ghastly. Young. The Marchesa di Vivaldi, of whose death Beatrice had given an imperfect account, struck with remorse of the crime she had meditated against Elena, and with terror of the punishment due to it, had sent, when on her deathbed, for a confessor, to whom she unburdened her conscience, and from whom she hoped to receive in return an alleviation of her despair. This confessor was a man of good sense and humanity, and when he fully understood the story of Vivaldi and Elena di Rosalba, he declared that her only hope of forgiveness, both for the crime she had meditated and the undeserved suffering she had occasioned, rested upon her willingness to make those now happy whom she had formerly rendered miserable. Her conscience had already given her the same lesson; and now that she was sinking to that grave which levels all distinctions, and had her just fear of retribution no longer opposed by her pride, She became as anxious to promote the marriage of Vivaldi with Elena as she had ever been to prevent it. She sent, therefore, for the marchese, and having made an avowal of the arts she had practised against the peace and reputation of Elena, without, however, confessing the full extent of her intended crimes, she made it her last request that he would consent to the happiness of his son. The marchese, however, shocked as he was at this discovery of the duplicity and cruelty of his wife, had neither her terror of the future or remorse for the past to overcome his objection to the rank of Elena; and he resisted all her importunity, till the anguish of her last hours overcame every consideration but that of affording her relief. He then gave a solemn promise, in the presence of the confessor, that he would no longer oppose the marriage of Vivaldi and Elena, should the former persist in his attachment to her. This promise was sufficient for the marchesa, and she died with some degree of resignation. It did not, however, appear probable that the marchese would soon be called upon to fulfil the engagements into which she had so unwillingly entered, every inquiry after Vivaldi having been hitherto ineffectual. During the progress of this fruitless search for his son, and while the marchese was almost lamenting him as dead, the inhabitants of the Vivaldi palace were one night aroused from sleep by a violent knocking at the great gate of the court. The noise was so loud and incessant that, before the porter could obey the summons, the marchese, whose apartment looked upon the court, was alarmed and sent an attendant from his anteroom to inquire the occasion of it. Presently a voice was heard from the first antechamber, exclaiming, "I must see my lord marchese directly. He will not be angry to be waked, when he knows all about it." And, before the marchese could order that no person, on whatever pretence, should be admitted, Paolo, haggard, ragged, and covered with dirt, was in the chamber. His wan and affrighted countenance, his disordered dress, and his very attitude, as on entering he half turned to look back upon the anterooms, like one who, just escaped from bondage, listens to the fancied sounds of pursuit, were altogether so striking and terrific, that the marchese, anticipating some dreadful news of Vivaldi, had scarcely power to inquire for him. Paolo, however, rendered questions unnecessary, for, without any circumlocution or preface, he immediately informed the marchese that the Signor, his dear master, was in the prisons of the Inquisition at Rome, if indeed they had not put an end to him before that time. "Yes, my lord," said Paolo, "I am just got out myself, for they would not let me be with the Signor, so it was of no use to stay there any longer. Yet it was a hard matter with me to go away and leave my dear master within those dismal walls, and nothing should have persuaded me to do so but that I hoped when your lordship knew where the Signor was, you might be able to get him out. But there is not a minute to be lost, my lord, for when once a gentleman has got within the claws of those inquisitors, there is no knowing how soon they may take it in their heads to tear him in pieces. Shall I order horses for Rome, my lord? I am ready to set off again directly." The suddenness of such intelligence concerning an only son might have agitated stronger nerves than those of the marchese, and so much was he shocked by it that he could not immediately determine how to proceed, or give any answer to Paolo's repeated questions. When, however, he became sufficiently recollected to make further inquiry into the situation of Vivaldi, he perceived the necessity of an immediate journey. But first it would be prudent to consult with some friends, whose connections at Rome might be a means of greatly facilitating the important purpose which led him thither, and this could not be done till the following morning. Yet he gave orders that preparations should be made for his fetting out at a moment's notice; and having listened to as full an account as Paolo could give of the past and present circumstances of Vivaldi, he dismissed him to repose for the remainder of the night. Paolo, however, though much in want of rest, was in too great an agitation of spirits either to seek or to find it, and the fear he had indicated, on entering the marchese's apartment, proceeded from the hurry of his mind rather than from any positive apprehension of new evil. For his liberty he was indebted to the young sentinel, who had on a former occasion been removed from the door of his prison, but who, by means of the guard to whom Vivaldi had given money, as he returned one night from the tribunal, had since been able to communicate with him. This man, of a nature too humane for his situation, was become wretched in it, and he determined minded to escape from his office before the expiration of the time for which he had been engaged. He thought that to be a guard over prisoners was nearly as miserable as being a prisoner himself. "I see no difference between them," said he, "except that the prisoner watches on one side of the door and the sentinel on the other." With the resolution to release himself, he conferred with Paolo, whose good nature and feeling heart, among so many people of a contrary character, had won his confidence and affection, and he laid his plan of escape so well that it was on the point of succeeding when Paolo's obstinacy in attempting an impossibility had nearly counteracted the whole. It went to his heart, he said, to leave his master in prison, while he himself was to march off in safety, and he would run the risk of his neck rather than have such a deed upon his head. He proposed, therefore, as Vivaldi's guards were of too ferocious a nature to be tampered with, to scale a wall of the court into which a grate of Vivaldi's dungeon looked. But had this lofty wall been practicable, the grate was not, and the attempt had nearly cost Paolo not only his liberty but his life. When at length he had made his way through the perilous avenues of the prison, and was fairly beyond the walls, he could hardly be prevailed upon by his companion to leave them. For near an hour he wandered under their shade, weeping and exclaiming, and calling up on his dear master, at the evident hazard of being retaken, and probably would have remained there much longer had not the dawn of morning rendered his companion desperate. Just, however, as the man was forcing him away, Paolo fancied he distinguished, by the strengthening light, the roofs of that particular building in whose dungeon his master was confined, and the appearance of Vivaldi himself could scarcely have occasioned a more sudden burst of joy, succeeded by one of grief. "It is the roof! It is the very roof!" exclaimed Paolo, vaulting from the ground and clapping his hands. "It is the roof! The roof! Oh, my master, my master! The roof! The roof!" He continued alternately to exclaim, "My master, the roof! My master, the roof!" till his companion began to fear he was frantic, while tears streamed down his cheeks, and every look and gesture expressed the most extravagant and whimsical union of joy and sorrow. At length the absolute terror of discovery compelled his companion to force him from the spot, when, having lost sight of the building which enclosed Vivaldi, he set off for Naples with a speed that defied all interruption, and arrived there in the condition which has been mentioned, having taken no sleep and scarcely any sustenance since he left the Inquisition. Yet, though in this exhausted state, the spirit of his affection remained unbroken, and when, on the following morning, the marchese quitted Naples, neither his weariness nor the imminent danger to which this journey must expose him could prevent his attending him to Rome. The rank of the marchese, and the influence he was known to possess at the court of Naples, were circumstances that promised to have weight with the Holy Office, and to procure Vivaldi a speedy release; but yet more than these were the high connections which the Count di Maro, the friend of the marchese, had in the Church of Rome. The applications, however, which were made to the inquisitors were not so soon replied to as the wishes of the marchese had expected, and he had been above a fortnight in that city before he was even permitted to visit his son. In this interview, affection predominated on both sides over all remembrance of the past. The condition of Vivaldi, his faded appearance, to which the wounds he had received at Salano, and from which he was scarcely recovered, had contributed; and his situation in a melancholy and terrible prison were circumstances that awakened all the tenderness of the father. His errors were forgiven, and the marchese felt disposed to consent to all that might restore him to happiness, could he but be restored to liberty. Vivaldi, when informed of his mother's death, shed bitter tears of sorrow and remorse for having occasioned her so much uneasiness. The unreasonableness of her claims was forgotten, and her faults were extenuated, happily; indeed, for his peace, the extent of her criminal designs he had never understood; and when he learned that her dying request had been intended to promote his happiness, the cruel consciousness of having interrupted hers occasioned him severe anguish, and he was obliged to recollect her former conduct towards Elena at San Stefano before he could become reconciled to himself. Chapter 33.